Chapter 3, Foreign Ground, 1987. Just stand next to the white people. They'll get off by 110th Street. Justin broke down his strategy for securing a seat as we shoved ourselves into the crowded number 2 train heading uptown. We had spent the day in Manhattan, taking a break from the Bronx, prowling the city's sneaker stores, checking for the new Nikes we couldn't afford. Now, on the subway back home, we stood in a crush of executives, construction workers, accountants, and maids, a multicolored totem of hands clinging to the metal pole in the middle of the car for dear life. 6 stops later, Justin's prediction proved out. A business-suited exodus emptied the train when we hit 110th Street, the last outpost of affluent Manhattan, and we were finally able to sit down. A subway car full of blacks and Latinos would continue the bumpy ride back up to Harlem and the Bronx. Justin smiled at me just as the train's last yuppie scurried out ahead of the closing doors. Justin and I bonded from the first time I met him. We wore the same haircut, a towering box cut made popular by rappers like Big Daddy Kane, whose elegantly chiseled high top was the gold standard. Justin loomed over me, standing at almost 5'6" in 5th grade, and his skinny frame made him appear even taller. His voice was deep, an excursion into puberty that had left the rest of us behind. He lived in the Soundview Projects, just minutes away from our house in the Bronx. We knew each other's neighborhoods, each other's friends, and each other's families. There was one other thing that helped us to bond quickly. He was one of the few other black kids at my new school. My mother had decided soon after our move to the Bronx that I was not going to public school. She wasn't a snob, she was scared. My mother was a graduate of the public school system in New York herself, and the daughter of a public school teacher in the same system. She knew the public schools in the area. The schools she'd gone to were still there, same names, same buildings, but they were not the same institutions. The buildings themselves were dilapidated, crumbling walls and faded paint, and even if you were one of the lucky 50% who made it out in 4 years, it was not at all clear that you'd be prepared for college or a job. Just as the street corners of the Bronx had changed, so had the public schools. Things were falling apart, and the halls of the school were no exception or refuge from the chaos outside. But no matter how much the world around us seemed ready to crumble, my mother was determined to see us through it. When we moved to New York, she worked multiple jobs, from a freelance writer for magazines and television to a furrier's assistant, whatever she could do to help cover her growing expenses. She had to provide for us, and she was helping out her parents, who were living off of 2 small pensions and their small monthly Social Security check. My mother would wake us up in the morning for school, and before we could even finish getting dressed, she was off to work, leaving my grandparents to get us there. My grandparents would pick us up after school, prepare dinner for the family, and get us to bed. Late into the night, my mother would come in from her last job and walk straight to our bedroom, pull the covers tight around us, and give my sister and me our kiss goodnight. The smell of her perfume would wake me as soon as she walked in, and then comfort me back to sleep. My mother first heard about Riverdale Country School when she was a girl growing up in the Bronx. It was the sort of school you might find in a storybook, a fantasy for a public school kid. It sat along the banks of the Hudson River, and the rolling hills and the lush quadrangles of its campus gave it the grand appearance of a university. The ivy-covered buildings were like a promise to its students of what awaited them. It was a school John F. Kennedy attended as a child. When my mom visited the school again as an adult, she was immediately convinced that this was where she wanted my sister and me to go. Riverdale was in the Bronx, but was its own little island of affluence, a fact local residents were quick to remind you of in hopes of keeping their property values from collapsing to the level of the rest of the borough. My mother saw Riverdale as a haven, a place where I could escape my neighborhood and open my horizons. But for me, it was where I got lost. Justin and I got off the subway, covered with graffiti tags and all-city murals, at Gun Hill Road and began the 10-minute walk home. Everything about the Bronx was different from downtown Manhattan, more intense and potent. Even the name of the street we walked down, Gun Hill Road, suggested blood sport. As soon as we hit the Bronx bricks, our senses were assaulted. We walked through a fog of food smells blowing in from around the world. Beef patties and curried goat from Jamaican Spot, deep-fried dumplings and chicken wings from the Chinese takeout joint, cucho fritos from the Puerto Rican lunch counter. Up and down the street were entrepreneurial immigrants in colorful clothes, embroidered guayaberas and flowing kente and spray-painted t-shirts, hustling everything from mixtapes to t-shirts to incense from crowded sidewalk tables. The air rang with English and Spanish and every imaginable accent, spoken by parents barking orders to their children or young lovers playfully flirting with each other. By now, all this felt like home. On the way to my house, we decided to stop by Ozzy's to see if our crew was around. Ozzy was our boy, tall and dark skinned, with a close cropped Caesar and a soft Caribbean accent like his father's. His basketball skills transcended his years. He was only in fifth grade when high school started to recruit him. As expected, there they were, our little crew sprawled along the white stone steps of Ozzy's house. Before I could properly get into the flow of conversation, Paris turned to me. How y'all like it up there at that white school? Paris was a good-looking guy with a brilliant smile that he rarely cared to share. He leaned back as he spoke. His question was a challenge. It's cool. It's whatever, I quietly replied, looking down at the ground. It was a sore spot. In the hood, your school affiliation was essential. Even if you weren't running with the coolest clique, you still got some percentage of your rep from your school, and the name Riverdale wasn't going to impress anyone. If anything, it made my crew kind of suspicious of me, so I quickly changed the subject. What's up with the Knicks this year? Lame, I know, but I was desperate. Most of my neighborhood friends were attending public schools in the area. A few were attending Catholic school. But Justin and I were the only two who actually went all the way across town to attend a predominantly white private school. It would take as long as an hour and a half some days, depending on traffic, stalled trains, weather, and other factors. But we would make it there, and on time, at least initially. Nah, for real, what's up with Riverdale? Paris asked, bringing the topic back. His voice rose on the last word as he made the best attempt at a proper British accent. I had to admit that Riverdale sounded a little like something out of Archie comics. It was embarrassing. I decided to try a different tack. Yeah, it's cool, man. Nobody messes with me over there. I have the place on lock. I started, unconvincingly. My feet shuffled and my voice lowered a few octaves. I caught Justin out of the side of my eye, shaking his head with amazement at the nonsense that was coming out of my mouth. I could feel the burn of his skeptical stare on the side of my face, but I pressed on. Let me tell you how I run things up there, I said, and launched into the story of my recent suspension from school. A few weeks earlier, I had been suspended for fighting. I was playfully wrestling with a kid from my grade when I decided to go for a killer move. I grabbed his right arm with mine and hoisted him over my shoulder, then dropped him hard on the ground. The fall was awkward, and he landed on his head, opening a small but surprisingly bloody cut. After the boy was rushed to the school nurse and eventually to the hospital to get a few stitches, I was suspended for fighting. That was the truth. For my friends, I decided to juice up the story a little, or a lot. The story I told had the boy disrespecting me and me getting in his face to respond. When he kept jawing, I picked him up over my head and slammed him to the ground. Then I stood over his bleeding body, taunting him like Muhammad Ali over Sonny Liston, daring him to get back up. My friends looked over at Justin, who had a pained expression on his face. He knew the truth, and soon the rest of my friends did too. I became the butt of petty, unrelenting taunting. My attempt at creating a Westmore legend had backfired. I was saved after about 20 minutes when a man stumbled towards us. His hair looked like it hadn't seen a comb in weeks. There were laces in only one of his filthy sneakers. Can you young brother spare some change? I need to make a phone call, he stuttered. An old and unpleasant odor preceded him.